Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the fourth and final session of the APDA Northwest Beyond Medication series titled Cognitive Fitness. I am so pleased to welcome back for our fourth session Dr. Karen Torres from University of Washington Medical Center. Dr. Torres is a neuropsychologist. This is the fourth session, so if you're seeing this video and haven't seen the first three, you might want to go backwards and watch the other two because they kind of build upon one another. So today, what are we covering, Karen? We're covering cognitive training. I had forgotten. So thank you so much for being here for this program, Karen, and I will let you take it away and I will come back at the end. I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody. I meant to do that. So Dr. Torres, you're going to need to unmute yourself after I do that, just to cut down on background noise.
Okay.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Our fourth and last meeting, and it's been really great. But we'll talk about that at the end. So, just to review what we've done already, week one we focused on lifestyle factors that impact brain function, and the importance of exercise, eating healthy, good sleep on the brain. Then we focused on executive function and how this one area of thinking does affect people with Parkinson's quite a bit. And we talked about strategies to improve functioning in this area. Last week we talked about mood.
I'm in a webinar right now. Get
Oh,
back
Jen,
Okay, I'm writing it down so I don't forget.
Jen, can you?
Okay.
We'll see.
Oh, I didn't mute myself and now I'm talking on the phone. I'm so sorry.
Thank you, Jen. Last week we talked about mood and how specific mood symptoms can impact your overall brain health and function. It can affect cognitive abilities and the importance of not isolating and how social isolation that can be due to mood symptoms can definitely exacerbate the function and the well-being of your brain. And today we'll wrap it up with cognitive training, discussing, everyday strategies and tools you can do to keep your brain healthy. So we'll take some time initially for any volunteers who want to talk about how their suggested assignment went from last week. We talked about picking one thing that can definitely help improve your mood. If you're feeling down, if you're feeling anxious, what was one thing you did that helped you lift from those symptoms? And then we'll talk about the topic for today, which is in cognitive training, how new learning and strategy building helps with brain fitness. And then we'll have an open discussion and wind down the series at the end. So I'm definitely open to any questions about not only today's topic, but from previous topics as well. So to get started, anyone want to share how their experience went last week or this week with doing something to help improve your mood? Anyone want to share? Hi, Jim.
Hey there, how's it going? Nice to see you all
Good.
back again. So hopefully this fits in with our assignment. My strategy this last week was, I'll call it catastrophization interruption, where when I thought I was going down into that dark place of, there's no hope and things are going bad and all downhill, I would just stop and for a moment, be very mindful and analytic about what was happening in the moment and kind of try and interrupt that cascade of negative thoughts. I don't know what technique that's called, but I'm just going to, I don't know, stopping on
You're
purpose.
breaking the cycle,
Breaking the cycle. Thank you.
Yeah. And how did that go for you?
It actually worked pretty well. I think it's something that needs to be practiced to get better at and to make it more effective. Like anything.
Practice makes good. Absolutely. And it's something that can be just something as just being intentional, right? Like I am going to stop here and try to divert my attention to something else, because if I don't, I know what will happen. My anxiety will get worse. I'm not going to sleep so well, X, Y, and Z. So great job on practicing one strategy to help with mood. Um, Anyone else want to share? Okay. All right, we'll move on. And like I said, there will be time at the end to talk about all the other topics that we've discussed so far. So today we're talking about cognitive training, and it is it is impossible to talk about the importance of cognitive training if we don't first touch upon brain neuroplasticity. Has anyone heard about this before? What is neuroplasticity? All right. Well, I'm sure there's some of you that have, but just to kind of, repeat, neuroplasticity is the ability of the neurons in our brain to change and reorganize continuously to meet the demands of a changing environment, whether external or internal. Neuroplasticity is important because, yes, the neuroplasticity that occurs in our younger years when we're getting older happens at a very, very rapid pace, meaning that our brains start developing pretty quickly, and some of that stabilizes as we get older, certainly in our 30s, 40s, and 50s, but we still have the capacity to keep and maintain and strengthen the connections in our brain. And how do we do this? By enrichment. Enrichment in one's life helps promote this concept of neuroplasticity. Okay. So leading an enriched life, meaning, socially, cognitively, physically, can promote neuroplasticity, even if we're getting older, even if we have neurological diseases, even if we have psychiatric diseases, we still have the capacity to keep our brains healthy. In Parkinson's disease specifically, neurorehabilitation has been an intervention that's been discussed that helps promote neuroplasticity. As I'm sure you are all aware, you've all been recommended to perhaps see a physical therapist to help with motor symptoms, to help strengthen your balance, occupational therapy to help navigate your way around your homes and with everyday activities, speech and language therapy to help guide recommendations for, working on your voices, on how you communicate with one another with Parkinson's. And then there's the piece that we'll be focusing on today. We have been focusing in this series is brain health, and we've touched upon physical functioning, how that is important for neuroplasticity, social functioning, and the importance of being engaged with other people in social situations. And then today we'll be focused on the cognitive function and trainings piece of it. So common areas of cognitive impairment that occur in Parkinson's disease, and we've talked about executive function, okay? Executive function is by far the most common type of cognitive difficulties that people with Parkinson's disease experience. And we talked about how problem solving, organization and planning, thinking flexibly is probably one of the most challenges that we see in executive difficulties. And we talked about strategies of how to, work with these difficulties, how schedules and planning and having a routine in life can help with these weaknesses. But there's also learning and memory, okay? These difficulties are mostly tied to difficulties with attention. So people with Parkinson's disease may struggle with their attention, which subsequently impacts memory. So without an ability to sustain your attention and stay focused, your memory becomes compromised. And this mostly reflects short-term memory. kind of that new learning, what happened yesterday or the week before, etc., versus long-term memory. So since we talked about executive functioning already, this week, a little bit later, we'll talk about strategy building to improve memory. And so cognitive exercises are essential because your brain, like any other muscle in your body, you need to use it. If you don't use it, you lose it. Okay, so you need continual exercise of this muscle in your brain. So the more you work out your brain, the better it will be to process and remember information, the sharper it will be. The best brain exercises that exist break the routine and challenge your brain into new brain pathways. So engaging in meaningful activities have been shown in the research to be an effective way of improving cognitive health or brain health. Memory specifically, one study found that people who took on the skills of quilting or digital photography improved memory. Other studies have included how becoming more involved in the arts, like music and singing, painting, has been shown to reduce stress and improve mood. And we know that if we're feeling better emotionally, our brains have a better capacity of thinking much more clearly. So engaging in meaningful activities has been demonstrated to be effective when it comes to the health of the brain. So what kind of cognitive training exercises exist? There are several, okay? I hear this all the time from folks. I work on my 100-piece puzzle every day, or the New York Times crossword puzzle, or I love reading books. These are good training exercises because you're continuously doing something to engage your brain. However, these type of activities tend to be a little bit more on the passive side, because if you always work on a crossword puzzle, then you're tapping into a skill that is very well rehearsed, that you have an approach to solving. And so you already know this skill. Same with reading books, right? You enjoy reading books, that's great, but it's more of a passive type of activity. There's computer-based cognitive training. I'm sure some of you have heard about things like Lumosity, which is a computer-based training program that helps improve attention and how quickly you process information. But the research on how effective this is in improving overall cognitive function is very limited, meaning something like Lumosity and the different activities that you do there helps improve your ability to complete that task specifically. You get good at Lumosity. It hasn't been demonstrated for you to be able to take what you get good at in this app and take it onto the real world. It hasn't been demonstrated. So when patients ask me about this, I say it won't hurt. But certainly if you have to pay for it, it may not be worth it. And a lot of these app-based cognitive training programs, you do have to pay. If they're free, it's great. It will not hurt you. But if you have to pay, it's worth considering that it may not be worth the benefit because it hasn't been demonstrated to be beneficial in everyday life. And then there's new learning, which is what we'll talk about today, because that is the more active type of training exercise that has been demonstrated, as I previously mentioned, to impact not only your cognitive function, but your emotional functioning and how well your mood and your symptoms are. So new learning is by far the type of cognitive training exercise that benefits your brain in the long run. So there's criteria for these cognitive exercises. It has to be new. So If you work on crossword puzzles, great. If you love reading, great. But it's not new. That's why I'm saying it's more of a passive activity. It has to be new because no matter how demanding a crossword puzzle is, if it's something that your brain is used to doing every day, it's not good enough. Okay. The activity needs to be something that you're unfamiliar with, that is out of your comfort zone, even. Okay. So some examples are, learning a new language, a new hobby, of course, picking up art, picking up an instrument or a new sport, something that takes your brain to think about something that it is not used to doing. And that's the key. Your brain has to start doing things that it does not know anything about. So doing that's something that is new helps with that. The other criteria is that it has to be challenging. Okay, it needs to take some mental effort. It requires new learning. You learning a new set of instructions, for example, for that new dish that you've never cooked, learning at a new recipe. It has to be challenging, okay? Because it will allow your brain to form new connections and say, this is something that I'm not used to doing. This is something that it's new, and it's a little bit challenging. Maybe I'm not good at it initially, but eventually you may get a little bit better. And it's not about becoming a master or becoming a pro or becoming a great piano player. That's not the point. The point is that the challenge will lead your brain to start thinking about something new, and you're learning about it. You're reading the steps, you're practicing. So it's in this learning process that the connections in your brain between the different neurons and the different parts of your brain are getting stronger, that they're maintaining and they're not declining over time. So it needs to be new. It needs to be challenging, but it also has to be fun. Okay. If you've never had an interest in picking up an instrument, don't do it. Okay. If you've never had an interest in learning a new language, don't do it. It needs to be something that perhaps you've always been interested in, but never have had the time or have never had the opportunity to learn. So, sometimes when people say, well, I've always wanted to learn about World War I history. Okay, there's options. There's books. There's a History Channel. There's a lot of Netflix documentaries. That's new learning because you're tapping into an area that you have no prior knowledge of and you're interested in. And it may be fun for you. It may not be fun for your friend, but it's fun for you. It has to be fun because that's how you get to doing things, right? We've talked about how in Parkinson's disease, motivation can be an obstacle to getting things done. Certainly doing something out of obligation or feeling that, I have to learn a new language or I have to learn how to play an instrument, there's no motivating factor there. So if you're not feeling that you're getting enjoyment out of it, it's not very likely that you will continue with doing something. Okay. So the key is for these new exercises to be something new, something challenging, but also something fun. Okay? So what if you have cognitive difficulties? And you say, well, learning a new instrument is going to be hard because I can forget things rather quickly, right? So, maybe if I start learning a book and I'm read chapter 1, I'm done with chapter 1, coming back later with chapter 2, it may be a little bit more challenging to remember these things. And this could be related to because you're having memory difficulties or executive functioning difficulties. But when you do have cognitive difficulties, you can still learn new things. You can still learn to do new activities. But the important piece is that you have to develop compensatory strategies to do these things. Okay. And by developing strategies, you're exercising your brain, you're training your brain towards shortcuts, towards thinking of ways of making things easier. So when we had the discussion about improving executive function, for example, the suggested assignment I gave you all is to think about one goal or one problem coming up and trying to figure out, okay, let's look at all the steps. Let's write them all down. Let's think about all the potential obstacles that will come our way so that we can know how to address it. That is strategy building. So you've already been doing compensatory strategies and training your brain in a different way. And strategies can not only help with executive difficulties, but also memory. And it's the more commonly used is with people who have maybe having a little bit more memory difficulties. So how do you remember? How do you keep tracks of dates and schedules, phone numbers? Leave yourself notes, make checklists, keep a calendar. And this is a tricky one because sometimes there's too many notes. Sometimes there's too many Post-its, and some are in the restroom, and some are in the refrigerator, and some of them in the car. Try to have one place that you can organize and keep this important information. Sometimes having electronics is a good thing, and sometimes it's a bad thing. Because if you're relying on, let's say, scheduling your appointment on your phone, and maybe sending this appointment over to your electronic calendar on your computer, sometimes they sync, sometimes they don't. But figuring out a way so that they do communicate is an important strategy. It's new learning, right? And it's important for you to keep track of things. So I think having a central place where you're organizing important information can be incredibly helpful. It's important to remember where we put things. If you're struggling with, finding your glasses repeatedly, misplacing your cell phone, your keys as soon as you go into the house, try to be more mindful, pay more attention. Because that is the biggest problem, is that we're not paying attention to where we're setting things. We're going into the house, throwing things here and there, and then where is it? So being more intentional, setting down your keys by the entry table and say keys, entry table, just repeating that to yourself can go a very long way. Routine is important. Having one place for your keys is the key, because then you keep putting it there repeatedly and it becomes part of your everyday routine and you're paying attention. And so when it's not there, it's easier to retrace your steps and say, well, it typically goes into this bowl when I get home. So what happened? What else did I have in my hands? Did I have dry cleaning in my hands? Did I have groceries? Let's go look into that grocery bag. It helps build into your everyday life. And sometimes people struggle with not remembering where they placed certain things. Where did I put my bills this time around? So if you're going to choose a new place to set things, it'd be a good idea to keep a list of where things are as well. Your recipe box, for example. If you have a box where you keep your recipes, or a notebook for recipes, it may be a good idea to write down that in this separately where the recipe box is, just to remind yourself in case you forget, or if you're cleaning. Sometimes some of us like to clean everything out. We take everything out of the drawers, they go back in, maybe not in the right place, and having that list of where things go can help be a guide for putting things back. So it's just more or less documenting and setting things with intention. That is important. Staying on top of things. A lot of us wear watches, they have alarms. That can be great because alarms help with reminding us to remember to do something, right? Whether it's medications or leaving the house 30 minutes 40 minutes before an appointment. I think it can be very helpful in keeping a reminder on your wrist. But we also have to be intentional of when that alarm goes off, whether it's, the alarm on your stove that the food is ready, or that, the boiling time is up. We have to be intentional to pay attention to it, because it's easier to maybe disregard it for the moment while we're doing something else. So we'll stop the timer, silence our alarms on our phones or our watches, and then continue doing what we're doing. We have to be intentional. So to make sure that that reminder we are getting is a reminder for a reason, that there's something that needs to get attended to in that moment. So if you're occupied doing something else, I would suggest writing down where you're leaving off with this other task, and then going to turn off the alarm, take your medication, and come back to the task you were doing previously. Okay. We've talked about this in the past. If you're going to a new place, it's always a good idea to acquaint yourself with a map, with the buildings, with where the parking structures are, what the options are for parking, for getting into the building. It's always important to plan ahead of time. And then you can ask your friends and family members for help as well. If you live with a care partner, they can most definitely help you with setting up alarms, setting up a calendar if you need it. If you try to do it, that's a big plus, because it's new learning. You're trying to do something new for yourself. And it's fine if you make a mistake, but you try again, right? And that's the important piece, is that you're trying to train your brain to get into the habit of doing something new, and that's challenging. To learn new information, your senses have to be on alert. Okay. If you need to wear hearing aids, wear them, because we can't learn any information if we can't hear. You'd be amazed at how many people come to see me saying that they have memory difficulties, they forget conversations, but then they tell me that they don't like their hearing aids. So the question for me is, can you hear what someone else is saying to remember it at a later time? And I know hearing aids can be unbearable for some. It's a very, very steep learning curve, and there's a lot of problems with it. But that should be at the top of the list, is make sure that you are able to hear. So if you tried all the hearing aids and you can't wear them, so if you want to focus on a conversation and learn or remember what's being said in this conversation, talk to people one-on-one. Get away from the noisy social areas, turn off the television, and really focus on this conversation one-on-one, because your attention will be much more focused and your ability to hear hopefully will be better. Okay. Similarly, if you have glasses, wear them. It's impossible to learn new information when we're not listening, when we're not seeing correctly. So your senses are incredibly important to learn new information. And then there's strategies for making memorization easier. I personally have a lot of difficulty with learning new names. I try. And maybe because I meet a lot of people on a daily basis, working in the hospital, but I've never been good at it. I've been much better at faces before masks. Since the mask, I was in a lot of trouble during the pandemic with meeting new people. But names for me have always been tricky. So if I'm intentional about it, after meeting someone, I repeat the name to me a few times in my head. Peter, Peter, Peter. That can be helpful. But what also is helpful is having a visual of making some sort of connection. If I meet someone with the name Rose, I immediately think of a red rose. Okay. If I think someone with the name of Kyle, I try to make it rhyme with something. Kyle has a nice smile, and just repeat it to me in those brief seconds after meeting someone, because you're trying to connect auditory information, which is learning a new name, with visual information, with a visual image. And by doing these two things, with trying to make these two connections, you're training your brain on how to remember names much better. So that's one strategy for memorizing or remembering. Acronyms can be hugely important when you're trying to learn a long list of information. I gave the example here of the word homes. If for some reason you need to remember the names of the Great Lakes, right? You're taking the first letter of each word to come up with a shortcut. And these shortcuts can be applied to other things, and this could be challenging. This could be something new. So let's say you're working on a new recipe and you need to go to the grocery store to get a specific list of ingredients. Come up with an acronym that contains all of the ingredients, or maybe not all, but a good amount of the ingredients that you need that you don't have already in home, so that it's easier for you to kind of remember each of the words on that list. Certainly, coming up with an acronym and writing it down is a repetitive form of learning. And I think the key is that when you're trying to remember something new, repetition is your friend. So repeating it internally, saying it out loud, writing it down, coming up with an acronym can be very important. And same with like chunking, grouping amounts of information. So with those ingredients, for example, that you need to get at the grocery store, let's come up with groups that belong in certain categories. Let's come up with the vegetables you need or the proteins or the dairy, because by grouping information into categories, it can help you remember much better. And writing them down in categories into groups that belong together helps with the repetition and the new learning. We used to be better at phone numbers maybe 20 years ago, before cell phones. Now there's really no need to remember or learn a long phone number. But this is why they're written in the way that they are, in chunks, right? In groups of numbers, by the first three numbers and then the last four numbers. Because if we're trying to remember information in just a long string of nonsensical information, it is impossible. So information that is broken down, ideally into categories, helps it become a more manageable chunk of information that you can learn. So it's about repeating, it's about making a connection, it's about trying to learn this new information via several senses, not only auditory, but visualizing, smell if possible. That can help with making memorization new, and will help you when you're trying to tap into this new learning of information, the new learning of learning a new hobby, okay? Learning a new language, learning a new card game will be key, because learning can be challenging, but if you try to figure out a way to learn it in a manageable manner, can make it very, very possible for all of us to do. Okay. All right. So I guess we'll stop here for questions, and then maybe we'll come back to summarize what we've talked about in the series. And I know there's a few questions that have popped up. I'll stop sharing for now. So let me take a look at the chat to see.
I think
Okay.
the chat is Barbara saying, just in case people didn't see this, living with PD is learning to MacGyver your way through life. Maybe
Absolutely.
with a little less duct tape than MacGyver, but yeah.
But it's also important to know that these strategies help everyone. It's not only people who have Parkinson's disease or other neurological conditions. I use these strategies in everyday life. They help me be efficient. They help me get things done, because it doesn't come natural. For someone to say that, for example, I've never had a photographic memory. The majority of people have never had photographic memories. So we need strategies in everyday life to learn new information. And of course, it becomes a little bit more challenging when you have something like Parkinson's disease, of course. But these are just, kind of like a recommendation of how to incorporate these things again in this phase of life. So, Jim, you have a question.
I had several thoughts as you were going through
Mm,
your presentation, so maybe I can get away with two things. So, just in this last bit about memorizing based on chunking, etc., I had a little giggle because I saw the number that you used as an example, and the reason for me that that's so memorable is it's to music, right? Eight
mm.
six seven five 309. So, in addition to chunking, in addition to mnemonics or acronyms or whatever, maybe putting something to a favorite tune would be a good memorization strategy. It worked for that
Ab-
number at least.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a matter of like tapping into different senses, different memories, different abilities. How can I make connections? It makes things easier.
The second thing, it was an earlier thought, a different part of your presentation. For those folks that have Siri or Alexa, it does have a feature where you can say, Alexa, remind me that it's literally those keywords. My keys are on the kitchen table, and then you can query it and you say, Alexa, where are my keys? And it'll
Mm.
tell you they're on the kitchen table. It doesn't maybe really support internalized memorization, but you know instead of writing something down, it is electronic. And there's a lot of apps and AI agents that can sort of help out with that if it's useful.
Yeah. And I think, you're right. Something like Alexa and other services can be very helpful. But it's a matter of, okay, what are you comfortable with, right? Are you comfortable with learning new technology, which for you, Jim, maybe you're great at that. For other people, they prefer writing things down, maybe, or maybe, learning something new like Alexa can be a little bit more challenging. If you want to learn Alexa, again, that's a great activity to engage in because you're tapping into something that you're not used to. And there will be a steep learning curve, but that's part of the fun part of the learning part, but also have a backup in the process. Don't rely on Alexa for all of your calendar needs. For example, still keep a paper calendar while you're learning Alexa. And as soon as your hit rate is 100%, then you can move on. But it's a wonderful example of how it can help. Yeah. Um, Dinah,
There
you
is
have your hand up?
yeah, yeah, go ahead. And
Yeah,
then there's a question in the chat.
yeah, hi. So I'm a librarian and um, uh, I work for a library for people with disabilities, and we help a lot of people who are blind or visually impaired. So, they have to rely more on memory. And it's interesting when I give out phone numbers, they tend to remember the phone numbers better if you string them together. For example, if you say 8567, they may not remember it as well as if you say 8567.
Mhm.
And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's chunking to a variable degree, right? It's what you're most comfortable with. So chunking by digits, 2 digits, 3 digits, 4 digits, it depends on what the capacity is. And auditory learning can be very wide ranging for some people. Some people do much better with just hearing the information and repeating it in the same order that they hear it. Other people need more grouping strategies. What were the animals on that list? What were the modes of transportation, for example? So it has a pretty wide-ranging variability.
So somebody asked about using HQ brain games, and they say it's science-based. What do you think about that?
So Brain HQ is also AKA Lumosity. So it's the same business. And again, a lot of the research has repeatedly shown that you get good at the games, but can you take those abilities out into the real world? So does that mean that does your memory get better for remembering medications, for example? Does your processing speed get better when you're watching a television program? That has been less shown to be the case, meaning that not that it doesn't exist, but sufficient research does not exist yet on how well your skills of learning this game translate into the real world. That's why I said it will not hurt to do these. If they're free, especially, great, right? It's something new. You'll learn something that's challenging. But if you have to start paying for it, that's a big question mark there. Yeah.
So my New York Times games, if I'm enjoying them, they're great, but they may not be building neuroplasticity.
Do the LA Times crossword puzzle.
Right. So yeah, no, not me.
Try something new, right? Something that you're maybe less familiar with. Yeah.
Yeah. Other questions in the audience?
All right, so maybe I'll go back to the slide to just finish up on. All right. So hopefully, you've learned some information in these past 4 weeks. I've tried to not make it overwhelming, but I realize that it can be, especially because as I was thinking about everything that we've learned to keep our brains healthy. So we talked about eating healthy, right? And how something like following the mind diet, which has been shown to be good for brain health, can be important. But with that said, you need to talk to your doctor about whether certain diets are appropriate for you. But certainly eating healthy is a good key. Same with exercise, right? If your doctor says you're good to do exercise, do it. And like I said, it doesn't have to be intense. It doesn't have to be every day. Put it on your calendar, schedule it once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week. The more and more you get into the habit and the routine of it, the more likely that you will be able to do it. Sleeping well, sleep is imperative. It's imperative for our ability to learn new information because we talked about how it is during sleep that the new information that we learn gets registered into long-term memory, and how if we have sleep difficulties, our memories are not being processed into long-term memory. Sleep is important for our mood function. We feel better when we sleep better. So sleep is important. We talked about getting around executive function difficulties, how organization and planning can help alleviate some of that dread and anxiety that big plans, big goals, big problems can present in our lives. And so how, developing a schedule, developing a plan of action to try to think about all the potential obstacles is really the key to getting things done, to making things much more manageable, and importantly, alleviating that stress and that anxiety that some goals, no matter how little or how large, they can be anxiety provoking. We just talked about memory difficulties of strategies, compensatory strategies, taking notes, memorization. We focused on emotional well-being, and how it's important to be mindful of symptoms of depression, anxiety, and apathy. Apathy can be a big barrier in everything that we've talked about so far, right? Because if we're feeling very apathetic, we're not going to exercise. We're not going to be out there learning new things. We're not going to exercise. So making sure that your emotional health is also a priority is an important key. Don't isolate. We talked about how social isolation can impact your brain, the structure of your brain, the function of your brain, and how it's probably one of the worst things you can do as you're getting older is to isolate. So the more that you're engaging with your community, whether it's one friend, two family members, choosing to call them on Thursday morning to get an update on what's going on, to get out into the community and engage, even engaging in these series via Zoom is a good way to socialize. You may be in your homes, but you're interacting with other people. Hopefully you're learning from other people and engaging with other people. So isolation is very important for your brain health, and the importance of continuing to learn, continuing to learn, engage makes your brain healthy. It makes you feel better of yourself. It builds on self-esteem, and it builds on your cognitive capacity. So new learning is the key to train your brain to remain as healthy as possible, along with all of these other things that we've learned in the past 4 weeks. I'm not sure if I'm leaving anything off that's important. And if anyone else sees it or can think about anything else that we've talked about that isn't here, let me know. But otherwise, I think that's all I have. I have some resources for some books for brain health that are hugely important. The High Octane Brain by Michelle Braun. She's a neuropsychologist. It's a wonderful book, kind of with the same idea of what we've talked about, a plan for fitness, for nutrition, cognitive training. It's a wonderful book. But I'll end here and stop sharing.
So one of the things that was resonating with me as you were talking, well, a lot of things were resonating, but I was just thinking about what APDA does. And, just so you all know, every day of the week, just about, you can take a virtual exercise class for free with APDA. So there's your exercise right there. There are webinars galore like this, as well as our Dr. Gilbert host series. We do in-person events like the one I just came back from in Montana. So opportunities to learn and opportunities to connect with one another as you're learning. And then we run a whole host of support groups, both virtually and in person, that people can engage so that they're not isolating. So hopefully we are a part of building that cognitive fitness and living well with Parkinson's, because that's what we're here for. So so you just reiterated some of the things that I work on a daily basis. So that's great. That's great. Dawn had her hand up, so I wanted to recognize Dawn and see what else you've got to share or ask.
Hey, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So under what circumstances might someone be referred to a neuropsychologist? And is there let's just say an ailment we could mention that we think we might have so that it could be prescribed and paid for by Medicare or what have you? But just to kind of get the whole thing rolling, what kind of a person would see a person like that on a regular basis?
Yeah. So that's so the latter part of your question. So we, as a neuropsychologist, we don't see people on a regular basis. So we see individuals for an assessment to see how their brain is functioning. So that typically means a one-time assessment with a follow-up to talk about the cognitive scores and the results and so forth. And typically we see patients who are reporting changes. They'll mention to their primary care doctor or their neurologist or any other medical provider who can make a referral is, I'm noticing that I'm not as good at remembering conversations, or, my care partner is telling me that I'm forgetting my medications much more, or I'm not motivated to do much. And so I'm trying to figure out if this is related to depression, or is this related to the Parkinson's disease, or both? And what can I do? So as a neuropsychologist, we look at not only cognitive function, cognitive changes, but also emotional changes. And if you have both, that's, even more ideal. So reporting changes, and your primary care may give you a quick test, like it's called the mini mental status exam, or the Montreal Cognitive Assessment test, which is a very brief kind of screen of your memory and other abilities, and you'll get a score. And if you fall below that score, then they'll definitely make a referral to neuropsychology. If you fall within the normal limits, it depends on the doctor and if they share the same concerns as well. Yeah. So reporting changes is a good way to come and see a neuropsychologist. Yeah. Unfortunately, and I'll also add one thing. Insurances do not cover baseline assessments. So if you're just wondering, I'm wondering what my brain is like, with no reported concerns, the likelihood of insurance covering that is very, very low. Yeah. I wish everyone could get a baseline assessment, but unfortunately, it's not possible.
Thank you very
All right.
much.
Any other questions out there before we wrap up our session today? All right, so you are going to get a post-series email. It'll have links to all of the videos that we've recorded, along with links to Dr. Karen Torres's slides. And we are also going to include in there a link to a short survey. So please, 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 I beg of you, to let us know how this went for you. Give us feedback on what we need to keep doing and what things that would improve sessions like this, because we will be doing more of these. And both Dr. Torres and I love to see and hear from you as to how we can do better or what we need to keep doing. So if you could share that, that would be wonderful. So please take a moment to take that survey. So our next Beyond Medication series is not yet finalized, but it is probably at the end of July, early August. And it is going to be about nutritional strategies for Parkinson's. Again, something Dr. Torres was talking about today. It will be another 4-part series with a nutritionist. It's going to talk about medication timing, balancing your gut health, how you balance your eating, and also talk about budgeting and finding healthy food for Parkinson's that can feed your body as well as not break the bank. So it will cover a lot of different strategies for that. So so stay tuned to the Sunday News You Can Use email that will announce it, as well as we will put it up on the APDA Northwest website when we get all of that finalized. Dawn, raise your hand again.
I did, sorry.
No worries.
Here's my last question. For the nutritional one that you're putting together, can that also include what's currently known on supplements? Or is it just primarily going to be food? Because we hear a lot about, all these various things that people are doing, and there's no data, but yet there's some evidence that they can be helpful. So I don't know if it's
He may
enough.
touch a little bit on supplements, and that'll probably come up in the questions. And you're right, there's a lot of noise out there on supplements, but not a lot of hard data that supports you must take this supplement, with the exception of a couple ones. So she'll so she can touch on that a little bit. Probably she will touch on that a little bit, because it kind of goes hand in hand.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right. So, Dr. Torres, thank you so very much for your knowledge and your time and the energy that you've put into this. I just think it's been full of some really, really great information, and I'm really glad that we've done it and that it is recorded for in perpetuity, and we'll have to come up with another session in the future. So
Absolutely.
we can plot on that.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank you, Jen, and thank everyone who attended 1 week, all 4 weeks. It's been a true pleasure. I mean, it is a true pleasure and a privilege of mine to do outreach in brain health. And so I really, really, really do appreciate the opportunity to meet with all of you for the past 4 weeks. And I look forward to seeing you in the future.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to stop our recording.